I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The words, sharp and brittle as winter ice, slivered through the gap and found me where I sat mending a frayed cuff in the dim light of the hall. "I pity the man who ends up with her," my cousin Clarissa said, her voice a confection of false sympathy and genuine malice. "So plain, so silent. She is more mouse than woman." A murmur of assent came from my stepmother, Lady Anya, a sound like dry leaves skittering across flagstones. They were discussing me, Ilara, the unfortunate and unmarketable appendage to their far more glittering ambitions. It was a familiar litany, a catechism of my own inadequacy that I had been taught to recite internally since childhood. I did not move. I simply continued my work, the needle a tiny silver dart weaving in and out of the worn fabric. To react would be to acknowledge the wound, and I had learned long ago that my survival depended upon a profound and practiced stillness. My plainness was a fact, as indisputable as the stone walls of our crumbling manor. My silence was a shield, forged in a household where my words were either ignored or twisted into weapons against me. I was the second daughter of a man whose first wife had died, and whose second had brought with her a daughter, Clarissa, who shone with the cold, hard brilliance of a diamond. I, by contrast, was the river stone, smoothed over by years of being overlooked, unremarkable and perpetually underfoot. The catalyst for this particular round of vivisection was the arrival of the Duke of Alastair. He had taken up residence at Blackwood Manor, the grand estate that shadowed our own failing lands, a sleeping giant of granite and glass. He was a creature of myth in our small corner of the world, impossibly wealthy, famously reclusive, and tragically widowed. For my stepmother, he was not a man, but a solution, the golden key that would unlock the debtor's prison that was slowly closing around our family. My father, Sir Reginald, a man hollowed out by grief and regret, had long ago ceded all control to his wife's iron will, and her will was singular. Clarissa would become the Duchess of Alastair. My role in this grand drama was simply to exist as unobtrusively as possible, a drab background against which Clarissa's beauty could more effectively sparkle. Our first encounter with him was at the autumn assembly, an event that had sent our household into a flurry of panicked preparations. Clarissa was trussed and ribboned like a prize hen, her blonde hair gleaming, her smile a carefully calibrated weapon. I was dressed in a faded grey muslin, a colour chosen specifically to render me invisible. As we entered the hall, a hush fell. The Duke was already there, standing near the hearth, a tall, severe figure in stark black. He was not handsome in the way of storybook princes. His features were too sharp, his expression too remote, as if he were observing us all from behind a pane of very thick, very cold glass. Grief had carved its signature into the lines around his eyes and mouth, leaving him with an aura of profound, unbreachable solitude. My stepmother propelled Clarissa forward, a galleon in full sail, while I trailed in their wake, my gaze fixed on the floorboards. I was meant to find a seat among the other spinsters and wallflowers, a quiet ghost at the feast. But as I moved to slip away, my worn reticule snagged on the edge of a passing gentleman's coat. The contents, a small volume of essays and a silver locket, spilled across the floor with a clatter that seemed to echo like thunder in the suddenly silent room. Mortification washed over me, a hot, suffocating wave. I knelt, my cheeks burning, fumbling to gather my meagre possessions. And that was when it happened. A pair of polished black boots stopped directly in front of me. I did not need to look up to know they belonged to him. A long-fingered hand, unadorned and starkly masculine, reached down and picked up my book. I finally lifted my head, prepared for a look of disdain, or, at best, polite indifference. Instead, I was met with the most intense and unsettling gaze I had ever encountered. His eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, were not looking at me with pity or amusement. They were looking into me. Not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman acknowledging a lesser being, but a direct, analytical, and deeply focused appraisal. It was as if he had peeled back the drab grey muslin of my existence and was examining the very architecture of my soul. In that single, protracted moment, I felt more seen than I had in my entire life. It was terrifying, and, in a way I could not yet understand, exhilarating. He straightened, the book still in his hand. He did not offer it back to me immediately. He read the title on the spine, his eyebrow lifting in a fractional, almost imperceptible movement. "Montaigne," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of recognition. He then turned his gaze from me to Clarissa, who was poised with a brilliant smile, ready to receive him. He gave her a curt, dismissive nod before his eyes returned to me. "You should be more careful with your possessions, madam," he said, and the words themselves were unremarkable, but the tone held a strange, unidentifiable current. He handed me the book, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, a spark of warmth against my cold skin, yet it sent a tremor through my entire being. Then he turned and walked away, leaving a vortex of silence and speculation in his wake. The following week, an invitation arrived, delivered by a footman in the Duke's livery. It was an invitation for my father, my stepmother Clarissa, and me to take tea at Blackwood Manor. My name was written explicitly on the thick, creamy card, not as an afterthought or a familial necessity, but as a principal guest. Lady Anya was triumphant, certain that Clarissa's beauty had captivated the Duke, despite his odd behaviour. She was also perplexed by my inclusion. "He is merely being polite," she declared, her eyes narrowing at me as if I were a puzzle she could not solve. "See that you remain in the background, Alara. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not, under any circumstances, draw attention to yourself." I had no intention of doing otherwise. The prospect of visiting Blackwood Manor filled me with a quiet dread. I was more comfortable with the company of books than with dukes, especially dukes who looked at me as if I were a complex text to be deconstructed. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a statement. It rose from the earth, a formidable edifice of dark grey stone, its windows like 100 watchful eyes. Inside, however, was a world of unexpected warmth and quiet elegance. There was no ostentatious display of wealth, but rather a deep, abiding sense of history and quality. Polished wood glowed with a soft patina, tapestries absorbed the sound, and the air smelled of beeswax and old paper. We were shown into a drawing room where the Duke awaited us. He was as severe as I remembered, but in his own home his solitude seemed less a defence and more a natural state of being. The conversation was stilted. My stepmother and Clarissa prattled on about London society, their voices shrill and artificial in the tranquil room. My father said nothing, a silent ghost in his own life. The Duke responded in monosyllables, his gaze distant, his attention clearly elsewhere. I sat on a small settee near the window, nursing a cup of tea, feeling as out of place as a sparrow in a cage of peacocks. I thought I had succeeded in my mission of invisibility until the Duke turned his head and looked directly at me. "Miss Alara," he said, the sound of my name on his lips both formal and strangely intimate. "Your father mentioned you have an interest in botany." I was startled. My father had not mentioned any such thing. Indeed, I doubted he was even aware of my interests. It was a fabrication, a polite social gambit. But before I could murmur a denial, the Duke continued. "My late wife curated an extensive collection of botanical prints. They are housed in the library. Perhaps you would care to see them." It was not a request. It was a command, cloaked in the guise of a suggestion. Lady Anya's face tightened, a mask of controlled fury, while Clarissa's smile faltered for the first time. I had no choice but to accept. I rose, my hands trembling slightly, and followed him from the room. He led me down a long, quiet corridor, our footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. He did not speak, and I was grateful for the silence. The library was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. It was a cathedral dedicated to the written word. Books soared from floor to ceiling on 2 levels, connected by a delicate, spiralling iron staircase. The air was thick, with the scent of leather and knowledge. A fire crackled in a vast stone hearth, and long, slanted ribbons of light poured through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes, dancing like tiny, golden sprites. For the first time since entering the manor, I felt my anxiety begin to recede, replaced by a sense of profound and reverent awe. I had found a sanctuary. "The botanical prints are in the east wing," he said, his voice softer now that we were away from the others. But he made no move to lead me there. Instead, he watched me, his expression unreadable as I gazed around the room. "You approve," he stated, a hint of something that might have been dry humour in his tone. "It is magnificent," I whispered, my voice hoarse with emotion. "It feels like the heart of the house." "It is," he confirmed. "It is the only room where I feel entirely myself." He walked over to a shelf, his fingers trailing along the spines of the books. "My father built it. My wife, she found it oppressive, too quiet." He paused. "She preferred ballrooms." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact, a chasm of difference that had existed between 2 people. He pulled a book from the shelf. It was a leather-bound copy of Virgil's Georgics. "Montaigne is for the study of man," he said, turning to face me. "But Virgil is for the study of the earth, the rhythm of the seasons, the taming of the wild, the foundations of everything. He was not speaking of botany anymore. We were conversing in a language of subtext and metaphor, a silent acknowledgement of our shared preference for substance over surface. He saw that I understood, and I saw that he knew I understood. A key was turning in a lock I had not known was there, opening a door into a room I had only ever dreamed of. Our time in the library was brief, perhaps no more than 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. We spoke of crop rotation and soil composition, of the Stoics and the Epicureans. He did not speak down to me, nor did he seem surprised by my knowledge. He spoke to me as an equal, a meeting of minds that was as thrilling as it was unexpected. When he finally led me back to the drawing room, the atmosphere had shifted. Clarissa's eyes were like chips of ice. My stepmother's smile was a thin, dangerous line. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had drawn attention to myself. The repercussions were swift and silent. Back at our own dilapidated home, I was treated to a level of cold fury that was more chilling than any overt anger. I was relegated to the coldest room in the north wing, my meals often forgotten, my presence entirely ignored. It was a familiar form of punishment, a slow, quiet erasure. I retreated into myself, into my books, clinging to the memory of the library at Blackwood Manor like a secret ember of warmth. A few days later, a package arrived for me. It was delivered by a boy from the village who said a man had paid him to leave it at our gate. There was no card, no sender. Inside the plain brown wrapping was a shawl. It was not just any shawl. It was made of the finest, softest cashmere, the colour of rich cream, and it was impossibly warm. I wrapped it around my shoulders, the luxurious fabric a stark contrast to my threadbare dress. There was only one person who could have known how cold I was, only one person who had the means, and perhaps the inclination, to perform such a secret, anonymous act of kindness. The Duke. The thought was a dangerous one, a seed of hope planted in barren ground. Kindness from a man like that, I knew, often came with invisible invoices. His invitations continued, always for our whole family, but the purpose was becoming increasingly clear. During these visits, he would invariably find a reason to draw me away, always under a plausible pretext: a tour of the winter gardens, an examination of a newly acquired map in his study, a discussion of estate ledgers. It was in his study, surrounded by the orderly world of accounts and plans, that our connection deepened. He discovered my aptitude for mathematics, my organised mind, and he began to treat me as a confidant, speaking of his frustrations with a tenant farmer or his plans for a new drainage system. He would listen to my suggestions with that same unnerving intensity, his grey eyes fixed on my face, making me feel as though my quiet, practical thoughts were the most fascinating words he had ever heard. One afternoon, as we stood before a large map of the estate, our heads bent close together, his hand brushed mine as he pointed to a parcel of land. The touch was accidental, fleeting, yet the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I drew my hand back as if burned, my heart hammering against my ribs. He did not apologize or pretend it had not happened. He simply paused, his gaze dropping to my hand, then lifting to meet my eyes. The air between us grew thick and heavy, charged with all the things we could not say. The formal space of the study, with its ledgers and its maps, suddenly felt impossibly intimate. "Ilara," he said, and the use of my given name, without its formal prefix, was a deliberate crossing of a boundary. "You must call me Julian." It was a seismic event, a tearing of the social fabric that separated a duke from a penniless spinster. To use his name would be to acknowledge the unspoken thing that was growing between us, this fragile, terrifying bloom of connection. I could not bring myself to say it. I simply nodded, my throat too tight for words. But he understood. He always understood. My happiness, however tentative, was a fragile thing, and I should have known it could not last. The world has a way of balancing its accounts. One morning, searching for a letter my father had misplaced, I entered his study. The room was cold and smelled of stale pipe smoke and despair. On his desk, partially concealed beneath a stack of unpaid bills, was a letter bearing a familiar seal, the ducal crest of Alistair. My heart constricted. I knew I should not read it, that to do so was a violation, but a terrible premonition, a cold dread, compelled me. My fingers, trembling, unfolded the heavy parchment. The words were stark and legal, a brutal arithmetic of ruin. It was a loan agreement. My father owed the Duke of Alistair a sum so vast it made me dizzy. The debt was old, inherited by Julian from his own father, a catastrophic investment Sir Reginald had made years ago. But it was the final clause that stole the breath from my lungs. The agreement stipulated that the entire debt would be considered null and void upon the marriage of the Duke to my father's ward, Clarissa. If no such marriage occurred by the end of the year, the Duke was legally entitled to seize our entire property, our home, everything we had left. The room swam before my eyes. The paper felt like ice in my hands. Every moment of the past few weeks replayed in my mind, but now they were cast in a sickening new light. His attention, his conversations, his kindness, they were not for me. They were a lie. He had been evaluating us, assessing the terms of his contract. The library, the discussions of Virgil, the cashmere shawl, they were all part of a cruel, calculated charade. Perhaps he was amusing himself, testing the quality of the family he was being forced to buy into. My intellectual connection with him was not a meeting of equals. It was the curiosity of a man inspecting a peculiar piece of livestock that came with the farm he was about to acquire. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness that rose in my throat. I had been a fool, a plain, silent fool who had mistaken a predator's calculated interest for genuine affection. I did not know how long I stood there, frozen in the cold, dusty room, the letter clutched in my hand, but a new resolve began to harden within me, chilling the initial heat of my pain. I would not be a pawn in his game. I would not be the object of his pity or his cruel amusement. I would confront him. I would take the one thing I had left, my dignity, and I would throw it back in his face. I walked to Blackwood Manor. I did not wait for a carriage. I walked the 2 miles along the muddy lane, the cold wind whipping at my skirts, the cashmere shawl, his shawl, feeling like a brand of shame around my shoulders. I did not ask for the Duke. I demanded to see him. The butler, his composure momentarily fractured by my wild appearance, showed me into the library, our sanctuary. The sight of it, the warm fire, the rows of silent, waiting books, was like a knife in my heart. Julian was standing by the window, looking out at the bleak winter landscape. He turned as I entered, a rare, small smile touching his lips. The smile vanished when he saw my face. "Alara? What is it? What has happened?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. The performance was flawless. I did not answer. I walked toward him and held out the letter. He took it, his brow furrowing as he recognized the document. He read it, though he surely knew its contents by heart. When he looked up, the colour had drained from his face. His carefully constructed composure had shattered, and for the first time I saw something akin to panic in his eyes. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Does it matter?" I replied, my own voice shaking with a cold rage I had never known I possessed. "It is all there, is it not? The entire sordid transaction? Was this all an entertainment for you, Your Grace, inspecting the family you were being forced to acquire? Did you find my foolish, bookish sincerity amusing? Was I a pleasant diversion from the beautiful but vacuous bride you are contractually obligated to purchase?" Each word was a shard of glass, meant to wound. He flinched as if I had struck him. "No," he said, the word sharp, vehement. "Ilara, you must believe me. It was never... You were never part of that." "Was I not?" I gave a short, bitter laugh. "I seem to be the central fool in this entire farce. You sought me out. You spoke to me of books and philosophy. You sent me a shawl because you knew I was cold. Were these just the polite gestures of a man toward his future cousin-in-law? A down payment on familial harmony?" "Everything else," he said, taking a step toward me, his hands outstretched as if in supplication, "was a catastrophe I did not plan for. The debt is an old, ugly business, an inheritance from my father I wish to settle quietly. I came here to meet your cousin, to assess the situation, to fulfill a duty I abhorred. That was my only plan." He stopped, his eyes searching mine, desperate for me to understand. "And then I saw you on the floor of the assembly hall, with defiance in your eyes and a book of essays in your hand. You were not part of the plan, Ilara. You were the thing that destroyed the plan." His words were a torrent, a desperate confession that broke through his legendary reserve. He told me he had been trapped, bound by his father's honour to an agreement he despised. He admitted he had used the invitations to get to know my family, but that his conversations with me had become the only real thing in his life, a lifeline in a sea of obligation. "You do not believe me," he said, his voice raw. "But I can prove it." He strode to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a sheaf of legal documents, tied with a fresh ribbon. "This," he said, holding it out to me, "is a deed of release. My solicitor drew it up 3 weeks ago, the day after we spoke of Virgil, in this very room. It cancels your father's debt, completely, with no conditions. It has been sitting in this drawer, waiting for the right moment to be delivered. I was a coward. I did not want our connection to be tainted by matters of finance. I wanted something that was ours alone, separate from all this ugliness." I took the document, my hands still trembling. I read the words, the date clearly marked. It was true. He had freed my family weeks ago, long before I had discovered the initial agreement. He had done it not because of Clarissa, but because of me, because of a conversation about a book of ancient poetry. The foundation of my anger, the certainty of his betrayal, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the staggering, terrifying truth of his feelings, and the mirror they held up to my own. "You must understand," he continued, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. "I have lived in a world of ghosts for 5 years, a grey world of duty and memory. I performed my role, I managed my estates, I existed. I did not live." He looked at me, and the last of his ducal armour fell away, leaving only the man, Julian. And then you looked up from the ballroom floor, and it was as if someone had finally opened a window in a sealed room. You did not look at me with avarice or fear or flirtation. You looked at me as if you saw me, and in seeing me, you unmade me, Ilara. You are in my every thought, the management of my estate, the reading of my books, the very act of breathing. It is all now measured in relation to you. It was a powerful, vulnerable monologue, a declaration so profound and earnest it left no room for doubt. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a slow, deep, and shaking wave of emotion. He had seen me, yes, but I had also seen him, the lonely man trapped inside the Duke. I had seen his integrity, his quiet intelligence, his hidden kindness, and I had, against all reason, fallen in love with him. "I believe you," I whispered, the words a surrender and a victory all at once. I accepted his confession, and in doing so, I acknowledged my own feelings. In that moment, we were no longer a duke and a spinster. We were Julian and Ilara, two solitary souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. We were an alliance. Our newfound understanding, however, was a private treaty in a world that still operated on public warfare. Julian's plan was to host a grand ball at Blackwood Manor, an event that would serve as the stage for the final act of this drama. He would formally announce the cancellation of the debt and, in doing so, publicly sever any perceived obligation to my family. It was a strategy designed to grant us freedom, but I knew my stepmother would not surrender her ambitions so easily. The night of the ball arrived, a swirl of silk, music, and glittering chandeliers. Blackwood Manor was transformed, its quiet halls now teeming with the county's finest. I felt a tremor of my old insecurity as I stood at Julian's side, wearing a simple but elegant gown of deep blue silk that he had insisted on providing. He must have sensed my unease, for his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own in a gesture of quiet, public possession. It was a small act, but it sent a clear message to the watching eyes. As expected, the moment came just after supper. Julian had gathered everyone in the grand ballroom, preparing to make his announcement. But before he could speak, my stepmother stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Clarissa stood beside her, looking pale and furious. "Your Grace," Lady Anya began, her voice carrying across the silent room, "before you proceed, I must speak on a matter of honour, a matter of a long-standing agreement between our families." She cast a venomous look in my direction. "An agreement that this scheming, unnatural girl has sought to undermine through her cunning and deceit." Clarissa took her cue. "She has bewitched him!" she cried, her voice rising hysterically. "She is a plain, penniless nobody. She must have used some sort of trickery, some sort of witchcraft to ensnare a man so far above her station. I demand that you honour the contract, Your Grace. I demand you cast her out." A wave of scandalised murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was the moment they had engineered. The public shaming designed to ruin me and force Julian's hand. They were attempting to leverage his honour against his heart. But they had underestimated him, and they had underestimated me. Julian did not raise his voice. He simply held up a hand for silence. "There is no contract," he said, his voice calm and clear as a bell. He produced the deed of release from his coat pocket. "The financial arrangement to which Lady Anya refers was an unfortunate business inherited from my father. I saw fit to dissolve it unconditionally several weeks ago. Sir Reginald is a free man, and I am under no obligation, honourable or otherwise, to anyone in his family." He handed the document to a nearby magistrate to verify, the man's gasp of surprise audible in the quiet. The public refutation was devastating. Lady Anya's face went white with shock and fury, but before she could rally, I felt a surge of strength, a quiet power I had never known I possessed. This was my life they were fighting over, my name they were slandering. I would not remain silent. I gently disengaged my hand from Julian's and took a single step forward. The entire room was focused on me, the plain, quiet mouse who was about to roar. "You are right about one thing, Lady Anya," I said, my voice low but steady, carrying to every corner of the vast room. "I am plain, and for most of my life I have been silent. I looked from my stepmother's face to my cousin's. But my plainness is not a failing, and my silence was never a weakness. It was a shield against a cruelty that I have endured for as long as I can remember. I will not be your scapegoat. I will not be the pawn you sacrifice for your own ambition. My worth is not determined by a marriage contract or by the prettiness of my face. It is something I own myself." I turned my gaze to Julian, who was watching me with an expression of profound pride and love. And it has, at last, been recognised. My empowerment was complete. I had not shouted, I had not wept. I had simply spoken the truth, and the truth had been enough. The social defeat of my stepmother and cousin was absolute. Their scheme was exposed, their malice laid bare for all to see. They stood there, isolated in a sea of judgment, their social ruin swift and total. Without another word, Julian took my hand again. He led me from the ballroom, away from the whispers and the stairs, up the grand staircase, and up again, until we reached a small circular room at the very top of the manor. It was an observatory. Its domed ceiling opened to the vast, star-dusted velvet of the night sky. The cold, clean air was a balm after the stifling heat of the ballroom. Below us, the party continued, but up here it was as if we were the only two people in the world. He turned me to face him, his hands framing my face. His stormy grey eyes, now clear and bright, searched mine. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You were magnificent." "I only spoke what was true," I whispered. "Your truth," he said, his thumb stroking my cheek, "is the most beautiful thing I have ever known." And then he lowered his head and he kissed me. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming. It was the culmination of every shared look, every hushed conversation, every secret kindness. It was the final, uninhibited resolution of all the tension and all the fear. A promise of a future that began in that moment, under the silent, watchful eyes of 1,000 stars. We were married 2 months later, in a quiet ceremony in the library, our sanctuary. My father, finally free from the shadow of my stepmother, who had retreated with Clarissa to the remote charity of a distant relative, gave me away with tears of genuine happiness in his eyes. Our life at Blackwood Manor was not one of grand balls and society events. It was a life of quiet partnership, of shared books and long walks across the estate, of managing the lands together, of nights spent in the observatory charting the constellations. It was a life of being seen, and of seeing another in return. Sometimes, when I am sitting by the fire in the great library, my hand in Julian's, I think back to that closed door, to the cruel words that were meant to define me. They had called me a mouse. Perhaps they were right. But even a mouse, when cornered, can discover it has the heart of a lion. My strength was never loud, but it was deep. It was the quiet resilience of a river stone, worn smooth but never broken by the relentless current. And it had, in the end, been enough to wear down the walls of a duke's lonely castle and build a home. And so our story finds its quiet harbour, a reminder, perhaps, that the truest value is not always that which glitters, but that which endures. It's a lesson in the strength found in stillness and the profound power of being truly seen for who you are. The greatest love stories are not always born in the blaze of a ballroom, but often in the hushed quiet of a library, between the lines of a shared book. I wonder, have you ever waited for words that were slow to come, only to find they were more precious for the waiting? Or perhaps there was a moment in your own life where a small, secret kindness changed everything. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite moment of our journey was. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, I would be so grateful if you would give it a like and perhaps share it with someone else who might enjoy a tale of quiet triumph. And of course, please subscribe for more stories of hearts that find their way home. Thank you for spending this time with me. I shall see you in the next one.